Bright lights. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Eric Bishop, and I'm Vice President of Student Services here at Chaffey College, as well as the Administrative Chair of the President's Equity Council. Today's lecture is presented by the President's Equity Council, whose mission is to ensure student equity among its highest priorities at Chaffey College, where 75% of the student population is from historically underrepresented groups. The Chaffey College Student Equity Plan reflects the college's commitment to providing the college community an environment where faculty, staff, and students can learn, work, and interact with each other in a supportive and collegial manner. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we start. Please make sure you silence your silence. It's not a telephone anymore, right? It's just a cell phone. Please silence your cell phone for the duration of our time together. There'll be an opportunity to ask Mr. Wise ask questions after his remarks, and we invite you to a book signing at the Wignall Museum immediately following the event. We also hope you take a few minutes to complete the survey that you were given upon entry so that we know about how our events are faring. And thank you. And finally, a huge thank you to Gary Reinschmidt and the amazing theater crew for their support in making today happen. And now, the reason you're here, on behalf of the President's Equity Council, I'm happy to introduce acclaimed activist, author, and educator, Tim Wise. Mr. Wise, wait till I bring him. Mr. Wise has spent the past 20 years speaking to audiences across the United States and internationally on topics of race, privilege, and activism. He is the author of 7 books, including his latest, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. Mr. Wise has been featured in several documentaries, including the 2013 Media Education Foundation release, White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America. He has appeared alongside legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis in the 2011 documentary, Vocabulary of Change, where they discuss the connections between issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, and militarism, as well as intergenerational movement building and the prospects for social change. Now, please join me in giving Mr. Tim Wise a warm welcome to Chaffey College.
A couple of y'all standing up, I hadn't said anything. You're gonna regret that. I could disappoint you now. I have to at least do something good for the 2 people. The rest of y'all, I clearly don't have to do much to impress, so I guess that's good. I'm tired. I've been on the road for about a week, so we'll see how this works. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I can't really see you. The light's sort of in my eyes. They're gonna adjust at some point. The bad thing about not seeing you is if you stand up to throw something at me, I'm probably not gonna see it, so it won't be my age and bad reflexes that explain why I get hit right between the eyes. It'll be the fact that I can't see. So try not to take advantage, please, of that. It's great to be here. It's an interesting time to be here, I suppose. It's always an interesting time to do this work, but I suspect that you know as well as I that this is a particularly interesting moment in which to be discussing issues of racial equity and social justice and racism, privilege, inequality, all of these topics that I intend to touch on today. It's an exciting time. I've been on the road doing this work for 22 years approximately and doing anti-racism work, education, activism of some form for a quarter century. And I can tell you without fear of contradiction that in that 25-year period, there's never been a moment when I felt on the one hand more hopeful about the direction of the country in the sense that I see amazing activism happening all around the country in ways today that I didn't even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 15 or 20 or 25, right? Whether we're talking about folks in the movement for Black Lives or whether we're talking about folks at Standing Rock standing up not only for clean water but for native land and for the sacredness of that land not to be despoiled by a pipeline. that would destroy that and poison the water supply of indigenous peoples on that land, or whether we're talking about folks standing up for immigrant rights, including the rights of the undocumented to be treated like human beings, as the rest of us demand, those fighting for the DREAM Act, those fighting for an end to deportations, those fighting for the restoration of La Raza studies in Tucson Unified School District in Arizona, one of the truly most groundbreaking educational, curricular, and pedagogical reforms of the last 20 years that I've seen, which unfortunately the state of Arizona has seen fit in its infinite wisdom or lack thereof to scuttle. So all these young people in particular standing up, right, and demanding change and doing it fearlessly, and even white folks doing this in solidarity with people of color, the folks in the 115 to 120 or so different chapters of SURGE showing up for racial justice, white folks subordinating themselves to the leadership of people of color, following an allyship and solidarity with them, standing up and challenging other white people about what our role in this work is. That stuff means something, and it wasn't happening 5 years ago, 10, 15, or 20 years ago in the way it is now. So that makes me incredibly hopeful. On the other hand, right, I can tell you without fear of contradiction that in that same 25-year period, I have never been as worried about the direction of the country, because for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And I suppose some of this activism that we're seeing is a reaction to, or is provoking a reaction from, other folks with very different agendas, right? People who are pushing back against, and you could use the word backlash, but that's a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because when the people in power are fighting to maintain their power and prevent any change, that's not really backlash, that's sort of frontlash, right? Because these are the people that have been in power all the time. It's hard for the powerful to backlash against the powerless because the powerless got no power in the first place. So really, maybe it's a frontlash, right? Folks who are challenging the very notion of multiracial democracy, let alone racial equity and justice. People who are attacking the notion of multiculturalism. People who are attacking the notion of small d democracy altogether. And we see that in some very extreme forms, and we have to figure out how we are going to respond, whether it's people who want to build walls shutting down access to certain folks, but only certain folks, right, and only walls on certain borders, right, because they don't seem to be particularly concerned about that incredibly long and apparently insecure northern border with the sneaky Canadians. Right? We never talk about building walls with Canada. Although I have a feeling if things go badly in a week, Canada's going to be building some walls against us. Right? You might be careful what you wish for. See, talk about walls, and then folks to the north are like, yeah, here it comes, because we got one for you. Don't be trying to come in here. We got laws against that, Be people plotting their escape. There will be no escape. See, what goes around comes around, but, right? Building walls with that border, I beg to remind you, an artificial border, the result of a war of conquest started by this country on false pretense against the people of Mexico, right? And so we want to keep them from essentially coming home, I guess is what it is, right? Sort of like if I break into your house, right, take all your shit and put it on the street, and you decide the next day, next year, at some point you'd like to come back and get your stuff, and I'm like, no, man, I changed the locks. You can't have your stuff back. That's sort of what we're saying, and that's what people are saying with no sense of misgiving, no sense of irony, no sense of the impropriety of it. But they're doing that as a backlash against the notion of multiculturalism, of multiracialism, because they want to, quote unquote, take their country back, or they want to make America great again, because we do remember, of course, when it was fabulous for the vast majority of people at some fictive time in the past that we now would like to hit the reset button and go back to like a video game. We all remember those grand days for people of color and those fantastic days for LGBTQ folks, and the days when women really had it made under unbridled patriarchy and misogyny, as opposed to the misogyny 2.0 weak shit we got on right now. We had really serious stuff, and I'm being sarcastic. It isn't weak at all. I'm just saying, right? We're going to go back to that, of course. So it's exciting, and it's also frightening. And we need to know where this is coming from, because if you're going to respond to a backlash or a frontlash or whatever term you want to give it, you sort of have to know what motivates it, right? It'd be easy to say, well, it's racism, and then we just write it off, and then my speech would be, how long I've been up here? Like 5 minutes. It'd be a really short talk, and I could just sort of drop the mic if this were a droppable mic. and I could just be done. But it's more complicated than that. Yeah, racism is a huge part of it, but racism has a lot of permutations, and I think sometimes we think of it just as this sort of blatant, overt bigotry. I think it's actually more complicated and more pernicious than that, right? I think racism operates primarily through three principal functions, or is operationalized by three particular functions in our society. And I want us to think about what they are and then why that's a problem and how we might push back against it. The first source of this pushback, right, is, first of all, just a persistent denial that there's anything wrong that needs to be protested in the first place by those young people I was mentioning, and even the not so young people who've joined them, right? So denial is one element of racism as it operates in America. The idea that, well, we don't need to have people in the streets marching for police accountability, and we don't need to have people fighting for immigrant rights, and we don't need to have people fighting for curricular reform, and we don't need to have people fighting for equal housing access or equal educational access or job opportunities or any of that, because we already live in a system of equality. And so all of these people are just troublemakers, and they're really not fighting for equality, they're fighting for supremacy. They are racist against white people. You know, I get accused of that, in spite of the fact that I'm sort of white. Right? People that are like, oh, you hate white people. Actually, I love me some white people. Love white people. My wife is white, love her. Absolutely adore her. Our children are white. Love them. Even though they're 13 and 15, love them. Right? Right? My mom, nice white lady. Nice white lady. Love her. She's great. My dad and I don't get along, but it's not because he's white. It's about some other stuff that, unless you're a therapist, I really don't have anything to tell you about that. Right? It's not really about white people, right? It's about whiteness. Racism operates because of a mindset of whiteness and white supremacy. It's not about white people. There are white people who've always turned against that mindset, and there are people of color who have frankly adopted it, right? And so we're talking about a larger thing than people. This isn't about good people and bad people. It's about how even really good people can be sucked into bad systems and transformed by bad narratives, right? And so this denial thing, for instance, right? I don't think it's mostly motivated by hatred or bigotry. I don't think it's motivated by an overt hostility. I think it's motivated by a profound veil of ignorance, sometimes a very learned helplessness. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's the pure ignorance, the kind that you just don't know anything because you couldn't possibly know it. Oh, white folks could know the truth, but we have studiously avoided it. And we've been subsidized not to learn it, in a sense, within our school systems or within our larger media culture, right? And it's a very long-standing problem, this idea that racism isn't really an issue, so what are these people yelling about? What is it that they want? That used to be the thing they said in the 60s. What does the Negro want? That was the phraseology. Now it's, what do these angry black and brown people want? What is it they're upset about? Everything's fine, right? But this is on the one hand, absurd thing today. We can see that it's absurd, I would hope. We know that, for instance, black folks, even with a college degree, twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, regardless of major, by the way. Latino folks with a degree, 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work, regardless of major. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, 25% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed, regardless of major. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 2/3 more likely to be out of work, even when they have a college degree, than white folks with a degree, regardless of major. A lot of other statistics we could look at. We'll talk about criminal justice in a minute. But it's rather obvious that to deny the persistence of racial inequity and disparity today is absurd, right? At least to some of us, it's absurd. To others, maybe it's not. But what's really absurd, and yet very telling, is that that denial isn't a 21st century phenomenon. I guess it would be one thing if white folks had just decided that racism wasn't a problem, right? Like if white folks had always been on board saying it was a problem, but then only suddenly decided things were okay, you might be able to excuse it, right? Like if our vision had been real clear all those years, right? And just suddenly we had some weird astigmatism, right, that made it impossible for us to see what people of color see. Maybe you could sort of be sympathetic, but it's sort of tough because the reality is that white America has never seen the problem at the time. It's one thing to see the problem a half century late, right? See, looking in the rearview mirror and talking about how bad it was back in the day, that doesn't take any courage, it doesn't take any guts, and it doesn't take a particular amount of insight, right? So if I ask white folks today, even those who are very much on the right wing of the spectrum, right, do you think that things are equal, not today, but 50 years ago? Do you think black and brown folks had equal opportunity in the early 60s? Every white person is going to say, well, of course not. We all know that. It's before the Civil Rights Act was passed, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. Hell, you could ask the Klan and they would agree it wasn't equal. They'd be happy as hell that it wasn't equal. They'd be like, nah, it wasn't equal, and that's how we liked it. Right? But here's the thing that's interesting. Go back and look at the polling that was actually done at that time, right? Because in 1963, the height of the civil rights struggle, that's the year of the Birmingham campaign, right? The year of the March on Washington, the year of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 young women, right? The year that Medgar Evers, the Mississippi chief of the NAACP, was assassinated in his driveway, the year George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door in Alabama and said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So it's sort of an important year in the history of the struggle. And yet in 1963, when the Gallup folks went out and they asked a large sample of white America, do you believe that black folks, I think they probably used the word Negro, but black folks are treated equally in your community, in housing and jobs and education were the 3 areas they asked about. Even though the answer now is obvious, right? Again, it's before the civil rights laws were even on the books, so anyone with any sense of history understands the answer to the question is no, of course not. But in 1963, when that question was asked, and when 1963 wasn't a half century or so in the rearview mirror, when it was the present reality, the contemporary truth, when it was not in the rear view but right in front of the car, right? In 1963, when asked that question, 2 out of 3 white Americans said yes. 2 out of 3 white folks looked at that America in which they lived and said, yeah, I think things are pretty fair. Racism? What are you talking about? Discrimination? What are you talking about? March on Washington? Why? Why are these black people so angry? What are they fighting for? Why is that when they're dreaming? What's he talking about, right? I have a dream? Why, good Lord, you're living in a beautiful dream right now, Martin. What are you talking about? Are you delusional, right? Now, in retrospect, we can make fun of this 2 out of 3, I suppose, right? We still got to ask why they were so quick to deny the problem, especially when it's so obvious now, right? 1962, Gallup asked white folks, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? Again, this is a pretty easy answer, right? In retrospect, we all know the answer was no. It's only 8 years after the Brown v. Board decision technically desegregated schools, but it's long before any school system really moved to integrate their schools, right? And so in 1962, when that question gets asked, 85 out of 100 white folks said yes. Black children have just as good a chance to get a good education as white children. Now again, in retrospect, this is absolutely hallucinogenic, right? But at the time, otherwise rational people believed it. And there are only 2 ways to sort of parse that data and interpret it. One is that white Americans were just so unfeeling, uncaring, hard-hearted, and stupid as hell, right? That they didn't see the problem, or maybe they did, but they just didn't want to acknowledge it. I suppose that's possible, but I doubt it, because I've been white a really long time. Been white for 48 years. I've met my share of white folks who are hard-hearted, uncaring, unfeeling, and stupid as hell. But I really don't think that's 85 out of 100 of us. I have a vested interest in not believing that 85 out of 100, or even 67 out of 100, whatever the other question was, right? I have a real interest in just trying to believe that that ain't my people, right? Plus, it just doesn't make sense, right? Because ignorant people can't hold power that long. So I don't think it's stupidity, and I don't think it's meanness or cruelty. My guess is it's the second explanation, which is that white people didn't have to know any better, right? White America didn't have to know black truth, right? Because when were you going to be tested on it? What was going to be the penalty for your ignorance, right? You weren't going to be tested on that. You could become a teacher and not have to know the truth. You could become a doctor and not have to know the truth. You could become a lawyer, a social worker. You could become a nurse. You could own a business. You could graduate from high school, graduate from college, med school, law school, business school, any professional certification you need to get in. You don't have to know the reality that tens of millions of your fellow citizens experience. So you could remain ignorant and still be considered educated. You could remain ignorant and still be considered knowledgeable. You could remain ignorant and still be considered competent. And whatever you think has changed in the last half century, and a lot of stuff has, let's not pretend it hasn't, but no matter what you think has changed, that right there, that has not. Because white folks still don't have to know black and brown truth, right? Because are you tested on it? Did you have to really learn the experiences of people of color in order to be deemed competent enough to get that diploma from high school or to get into college? Do you have to know that to get into law school, med school, grad school, or graduate from any of those? Is there any professional certification that requires you demonstrate knowledge as to the experiences, not just historic, but contemporary of your brothers and sisters of color? If you're white, no, we don't have to know that, those of us who are white. We can still remain ignorant. Now, people of color don't have that luxury of remaining ignorant about our stuff. Y'all got to know our stuff. You got to know it real well. You got to know it better than we know it, because we're going to test you on that. And you would best know the answer the first time, right? So you're going to have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know, we don't call it that. That's the point, right? When your stuff is the norm that everybody else's stuff gets compared to, you don't have to name where it came from. You don't have to racially designate the origin. You can just call it literature, you know. Theater, poetry, art. Right. That's why we don't have White History Month. You know that, right? We got a whole bunch of them. We just gave them these tricky-ass names so nobody would know, like May and June and July, and August and shit, right? We didn't want you to know we were doing white history, so we covered it up, right? You don't have to name the norm. You don't have to designate the norm, right? So white folks get to remain ignorant about people of color's reality and still remain competent in the eyes of authority. It's like that movie, The Matrix, right? You ever see The Matrix, where Keanu Reeves' character Neo is offered 2 pills by Lawrence Fishburne's character Morpheus. One is blue, one is red, right? And when Morpheus offers Neo the pills, he says basically, look, if you don't want to know anymore, you can take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up. You remain ignorant. That's where everybody else is. They don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know what's really happening in this society. So if you want to be like them, fine, take the pill, we're done. Or you can take the red pill, and I can take you down the rabbit hole and show you how deep it goes and show you what's really going on in this society, give you enlightenment, right? And Neo takes the red pill, and he starts to see, right, all the stuff that's really going on, that had always been going on, but that he just hadn't had to notice. That's like the perfect metaphor for race and identity, right? When you're the dominant group, you have the luxury of being on the blue pill, like from the time you pop out of your mama's womb, you were on the blue pill, like an IV drip, right? White folks walking around on the blue pill IV, black and brown folks are like, don't you see all this racism? And we're like, nope, got the IV in my arm. Don't see a thing. What are you talking about? You're seeing things, you know? Men, same thing. Women are like, don't you see all this sexism, this misogyny, this rape culture? And men are like, nope, blue pill. And I know that means some different stuff in the modern era. That's some pharmaceutical humor. You're welcome. My Pfizer rep is in the back with a check, clearly sponsoring this event. Not really, but I'm just saying, not that blue pill, the other blue pill, the Matrix blue pill, right? Not the Pfizer blue pill, but same concept, right? And look, here's the deal. Every one of us in here is oblivious to something, because every one of us in here has got some identity where we're the dominant group, right? May not be racial privilege, may not be class privilege, may not be gender privilege, but let's think, if you're able-bodied, for instance, right? You have the luxury, don't you, of being oblivious to what people with disabilities experience, trying to get in a room, out of room, trying to be in a workspace that's actually functional for them, right? If you're someone who has your hearing, you don't know what deaf folks experience in terms of autism so much. You'd never heard the word autism probably until right now. It's a form of oppression and marginalization of people in the deaf community, right? Worrying about, is there going to be an interpreter? Is there not going to be an interpreter? The cost and time involved in getting interpreters and finding them, that's privilege, right? That's obliviousness. I'm oblivious to a lot of things. I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all, because I never took it. You know why I didn't take it? Because they didn't make me. And if they weren't going to make me, I sure as hell was not going to volunteer for calculus. I mean, if y'all like calculus, good for you. I'm glad somebody does. I just knew it wasn't going to be me. That was my thing. I got freshman year of high school, they said, you got to take 3 years of math. This is the Nashville Public School System, 1982. 13 years old, they said, 3 years of math. I said, good, 3 years. Let me figure out how I can do that and never take calculus. I was smart, 13-year-old, right? Figuring out my whole life on the basis of not taking this class. It scared the hell out of me. So I said, what am I going to do? I got to take 3. I'm going to take algebra again. Took it in 8th grade, but got a B. Said, no, I can do better. I think I can get it up there. I didn't, but right? But there goes 1 year, right? Second year, I took geometry. Next year, algebra 2. Didn't even take trig, let alone calculus, and then I was done. As a result, I don't know how to do calculus. And if I were to stand up here on the stage and try to do calculus and any of y'all ever took it, you'd be like, hey, he does not know calculus. And then your neighbor would say, he told you he didn't know calculus. He never took the class. Exactly. Another perfect metaphor for race and identity in America, because a lot of white folks act like we know when racism is happening better than people of color do, and we never took the class. You get me? There are a lot of men who think that we know when sexism is operating better than women do, or when or if rape culture is even a thing, and we never had to take the class. People who are straight think we know more about straight supremacy, heterosexism, and transphobia than the folks who were the targets of it. Rich folks think they know more about poor people than poor people know about themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we never took the class. And it doesn't make us, oh, you can clap for that. Yeah, you can do that. And it doesn't make us bad people. It just means that when you don't have to know stuff, you're probably not going to know it. Right? So part of this backlash is rooted in this persistent intergenerational denial, the bubble of which we really have to figure out a way to pierce. The second thing that motivates this resistance is a mentality of entitlement. And this one is even bigger, right? Because when folks say they want their country back, right, there's a possessive form there, right? I want my country, right? Because white folks have had the luxury of believing that this belongs to us, right? And believing that America was a white country. As James Baldwin said, America was never a white country, right? But we had the luxury of believing that it was, and then if someone seems to threaten that hegemonic dominance, right? Not even threatening the power of whiteness, because whiteness still has power. That's what that unemployment data suggested, and I'll give you some more evidence in a second, but just threatening the hegemony, the total domination, right? Because if you've had 100% of something, and then you only got 90, oh, what's happening? And then you only got 80, oh my God. And now you might have to share and only have like 70, or I don't know, you're 64% of the population, maybe 64% of the stuff. Oh my God, the world's coming to an end, right? Because you believe you're entitled. And to some extent, that's what we see happening. We've seen it for a while though, right? Because so a couple years ago, this young woman named Abigail Fisher, you may have heard of her, right? Young white woman from Texas, from Sugar Land, Texas. Sugar Land, it's right outside of Houston, Sugar Land. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Sugar Land, she got rejected for admission at the University of Texas. My goodness, right? How dare you not accept a young woman from Sugar Land, right? She didn't get in, and she was convinced immediately and said so, right? Went and found a lawyer. She was convinced that the reason she didn't get in to the University of Texas was, of course, because they had rigged the system in favor of black folks and Latinos and Native peoples through affirmative action programs, right? She was just sure, because you know why? She said, I know people of color personally who had lower test scores and lower grades than I did, and they got in. And I had higher test scores and higher grades than they did, and I didn't get in, right? You hear this story a lot. Of course, what's interesting are facts are sort of funny things, right? And so, even in Sugar Land, right? Even in Candy Land with its, funny little characters on the board, like facts are still interesting things. So here's the thing. I don't know if Abigail Fisher was just lying when she said she knew such people who'd gotten in ahead of her. Here's the thing, though. There were only 5 such people. 5 people of color the year that she was rejected. I doubt any of them were people that she knew, because I don't think they lived in Sugar Land. But 5 people of color who got in to the University of Texas when she didn't, despite having lower test scores and grades than she did. So there were indeed 5 people of color who were quote-unquote less qualified, assuming that we believe test scores and grades are the only real determiners, which is sort of a whole different discussion, right? But even just accepting her definition of merit and qualifications, there were 5 people of color who could have theoretically been seen as bumping her. What's interesting is that same year there were 42 white folks who had lower scores and grades than Abigail Fisher who got in ahead of her, right? So what is that? That's a little over 8 times more less qualified white folks. She didn't complain about that. She didn't say anything about unqualified white folks bumping her. No, just those black and brown folks. That's entitlement. That's saying this space, the University of Texas, belongs to us. Oh, interestingly, another interesting fact, the same year that she got rejected, there were 168 black and brown folks who also got rejected, just like she did, even though they had higher test scores than her. and higher grades. So she wasn't next in line in any event. You got me? Like those black and brown folks had a better case than she did, but they didn't go whining and complaining and grabbing a lawyer so they could sue, because black and brown folks don't feel entitled to that space because they never were entitled to it. But Abby Fisher from Sugar Land and her parents lawyered up, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, where finally the Supreme Court got something right on that. Hadn't gotten anything right on affirmative action for a long time, but this is common, right? White folks who think if they didn't get something, it's because those people took it. I hear that from California folks. It's funny, right? Come to California. I didn't get into Berkeley because of affirmative action. All right, how old are you? 20. Okay, here's the deal, yo. In 1996, this state got rid of affirmative action. That's the year you were born. So you haven't had affirmative action in this state since you were in utero. What the hell are you talking about? You're going to have to find another excuse for why you didn't get in, because that one is gone, right? You just can't claim some stuff like that. I got an email from a guy several months ago, white dude. He's like, I can't find a job because black people and Mexicans are taking all the jobs. Really? All the jobs? That's what they're doing? All the jobs they're taking? All the jobs? Really? Okay, first of all, here's a little side note. This is the same kind of person that tells me black and Mexican folks are lazy. All right, which is it, sweetheart? Because it can't be both. If you took all the jobs, by definition, I'm going to let you catch up to that. If you took all the jobs, you are the exact opposite of lazy. And if you are lazy, I'm thinking you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. You didn't want a job at all, right? So, and I don't ask much from racists because I expect very little, but I do require some consistency. I mean, I just need you to follow through. That's all. Just pick a stupid and follow it through. Pick a stereotype and stick with that. It's not fair. It's not fair to have to shoot at a moving target, metaphorically, of course, because I'm not violent, but it's not fair. It's not nice. Just pick one, right? But of course, neither one's right? But he says this. He says, they're taking all the jobs. What did I just tell you? I just told you that unemployment, even when people of color have the same education, same major, still twice as likely to be out of work. So clearly, whatever jobs black and brown folks are taking from white people, they are not taking them far, right? Taking them about a block and then, nope, there you go, right? Clearly that job was meant for you. But that's entitlement, right? It's the idea when folks say immigrants are taking my job, our job. First of all, did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have the job already, that shit was not your job, right? Like if an immigrant came in and you were working real hard, like at your desk that day or on the assembly line, and then the boss was like, you're out, that guy's in, then you might have a complaint. That is not happening, right? So if an immigrant is getting a job that you didn't even know existed, let alone had not applied for, they didn't take your job. They got a job that somebody else decided to give them, probably because they knew they could exploit them better and not have to pay them even minimum wage, particularly if they're undocumented. So the white employer took advantage of both of y'all, and you're mad at the brown person. Now, isn't that interesting how that works, right? Right? Immigrants can't, it's not like Mexico, right, has, because companies are sending jobs away. I mean, companies will just move stuff. They'll put their money in a Cayman Island bank account. They'll move the plant to Mexico. They'll move the plant to Sri Lanka. It's not like Mexico's got a big-ass magnet that makes them do that, right? It's not like Mexico's down there going, come on, let's attract the business. Come on, make them come. Force them to come. And the white people in the corporate, corner office is like, damn, I wanted to stay and hire these white people, but these crafty Mexicans are with their damn magnet, forcing me to relocate the plant, right? It's not their fault, right? White folks are giving jobs away to take advantage and make more money, put it in their pockets. Mexican folk didn't tank Wall Street, right? Rich white dudes with high SAT scores, I'm guessing, right? An MBA, some of them from Sugar Land, they tanked Wall Street. They did it in an 18-month period, too. A year and a half. They lost or stole or squandered $12.5 trillion of other people's money. 20% of the accumulated net worth of the country. It took 230 some odd years to build, and these white boys were like, give us a year and a half. We will wipe it out. And they did. There were no Mexican folk, documented or not, in that room. There were no black folks in those rooms to speak of, no Asian American folks to speak of, very few women of any race or ethnicity, damn near no poor folks, that's for sure. But we're not, at this point, so far as I know, racially profiling rich white men, wondering if they've got evidence in the trunk of their Lexus of some financial impropriety. Pop the hood, we think we got you. We think you've got evidence that you've been moving money around and taking advantage of poor people, right? We don't do that. Because those rich white guys can destroy the economy and it doesn't stick to the rest of us. That's privilege too, right? The privilege of not being labeled a criminal when you a bunch of y'all in that same group do something untoward. So it's entitlement to be seen as a rugged individual, entitlement to believe that you have the right to be in a particular space. And this kind of stuff has been said for a very long time, right? Every step forward for people of color has been met with that kind of backlash, with that sense that our rights were being taken away. You know, when the first time that came up, this whole notion of reverse discrimination and somehow white people being the victims, I mean, it was over 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago. You know, after the Civil War ended and emancipation took place, and all of a sudden they had these civil rights laws that got passed in the wake of emancipation in the 1870s during the Reconstruction period. And in 1883, the Supreme Court had a case in front of it that was a lawsuit aimed at those civil rights laws, right, trying to overturn them. And because white folks were done, right? After like 20 years of emancipation and 10 years of civil rights laws, we'd had enough. We'd seen enough, right? Hundreds of years of oppression, you got a decade of, some opportunity, and then we're out. And so the court gets this case, and Justice Joseph Bradley writes for the court in a majority opinion. He says, as the court strikes down these civil rights laws, the rationale they gave was that it was time, in the words of Judge Bradley, was time for the Negro to stop being the special favorite of the law and to take his place among mere citizens, right? In other words, it was this rhetoric of preferential treatment. It's time for them to stop getting preferential treatment. What was the preferential treatment? Well, there's the Freedmen's Bank and the Freedmen's Bureau and a couple of laws that essentially prohibited discrimination, but apparently being protected against discrimination was being preferred in the eyes of the court, right? That's reverse discrimination rhetoric, not 10 years ago, not 5 minutes ago, not that dude sending me that email, but Justice Bradley in 1883 saying, yeah, y'all have had it too good for too long. It's time to be a mere citizen, like us white people, just a mere citizen, as opposed to recognizing that not only were white folks not mere citizens, we'd been the only citizens up to that point. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first law passed after Congress ratifies the Constitution. What did it say? It said all free white persons and only free white persons shall be citizens of the United States. So when you say time to join the rank of mere citizens, you say that like there were other types of citizens, but there were just one type, and it was all white folks. And Justice Bradley is saying after about 20 years of getting rid of that, or even less than 20 years since the passage of the 13th Amendment, that we were done with it. So this backlash has happened at every single step. It happened when black folks moved north in the Great Migration, met with riots and lynching, right? It happened during the period of integration of schools, right, where you had entire neighborhoods that just completely shut down their public schools all throughout the South, built white flight academies, ran to the suburbs to try to get away from people of color. You have a black man become president of the United States, and suddenly we have a voter fraud problem in America that has to be stamped out, right? Notice there was apparently no voter fraud ever until Barack Obama became president, right? The system was just fine up until that black dude won, and then all of a sudden it's like, I think people must be cheating, right? Didn't happen when George W. Bush won, even in 2000. There apparently was no fraud going on in Florida, right? Never happened with Reagan, didn't even happen with Clinton or with Carter. It's just Obama. By God, something must be wrong. We need to change that. We've got to pass some laws, make it harder to vote, see? Right? So we pass these laws, photo ID, and people say, well, why shouldn't you have to show a photo ID to vote? You have to show a photo ID to get a beer. Okay, where is beer in the Constitution? Right? Certain things are sort of protected, other things are not, and there's a reason for it, right? The idea you need photo ID. Well, if you don't have photo ID, they're going to cheat. They're going to cheat. People are going to vote 10 times. The hell? What? First of all, there are 31 cases of in-person voter fraud that have been documented. And in-person voter fraud is the only kind photo ID can catch, right? Doesn't catch absentee ballot fraud. Nobody's checking photo IDs when you send in the absentee ballot, so it wouldn't even stop that. That's the easiest kind of fraud to pull off, and it's the kind that happens most when it happens. But they didn't even try to stop that, which is interesting. Wonder why. Oh, because absentee ballot is mostly done by white folks, middle class and above. They're not trying to keep them from voting. But that photo ID we know has a disproportionate effect on people of color and low-income folks because they're less likely to have a driver's license, less likely to have photo ID. So you can keep them from voting by having this rule. It's got nothing to do with fraud. 31 cases of in-person fraud over a 15-year period. 31 cases in 15 years. That's not enough to steal your 8th grade student council election, let alone a presidential race. The hell, it's not about fraud. And they also, it's not about fraud because they said, oh, and by the way, you can't use that college ID you've got, even if it has a photo on it. That's not enough. No, it's got to be an official state ID because, those photo IDs they give you in college, you'll fake that. Oh, yeah. Because I remember distinctly being a college student and thinking to myself, you know what? I need a fake ID. And you know why? So I can vote 5 times. Yeah, that's why we do it. Yeah, that's why we have fake IDs in college, right? But they'll let you bring your gun registration license with a photo on it, because nobody would ever fake that, right? Who would ever commit fraud to get a gun in America? That's a crazy thing to believe. Right? Those students are sneaky. Gun owners, they always abide by the law. They would never lie. No one would ever lie to get a firearm. Right? So it's about suppressing certain votes and not other votes. And it only became, and it's not, come on, it's so transparent. Not only do they want photo ID, they want to shut down early voting. What's early voting got to do with fraud? Is there any evidence that people vote early and then that's when they commit fraud? Like if they could just wait till election day, they'd be chill. But on like 2 weeks earlier, they're like, screw it, I'm going in. And I'm going in 5 times, by the way. Like that doesn't even make sense because early voting, there are fewer people usually. So it'd be harder to even pull that off. Like election day, there's a crush. Maybe you could do it, put on a different hat, put on a mustache, something, right? But on early voting, it's like some places you might have 9 people going in there. I saw you already. You can't get away with fraud in early voting, but you know who votes early disproportionately? People of color, working class, and lower income folks, because they can't get off the shifts maybe on election day, right? So it's certain people that they're trying to keep from voting. And that's, again, a form of backlash based on entitlement, the idea that we have the right to elect the president. We have the right to determine who's going to govern because, again, this is our country. So that's the second thing, right, this notion of entitlements. And that's certainly what's going on with the debate about the border, right? It's this idea that these people don't have a right to be here. And again, going back to the thing I said about the Canadian border versus the Mexican border, it's not just something I did for a laugh. Like, it's interesting, isn't it? It's not that we have a problem with immigrants. It's not even that we have a problem with undocumented people, because 40% of the undocumented in this country did not come across that southern border. 40% of the people who don't have quote-unquote papers, who are not quote-unquote legal, are people who came on a legal visa, very few of them Mexican, and overstayed that visa. A disproportionate number of those happen to be from Europe. The largest single country happens to be Canada, right? So if we're really worried about legal and illegal, documented and undocumented, why would we ignore 40% of the people who aren't even crossing that border at all? Because it's not about documentation. It's about color. It's about culture. It's about language. It's about, oh, those people, right? They're the problem, as opposed to these people up here who aren't, or people from Europe who aren't, or people from just about anywhere else who aren't. It's about race. And that's the second thing then, entitlement, right? And the third thing is a lack of historical memory, right? And this is something our schools could potentially do something about had we the will to make it so, right? The reason it's so hard to get our head around the protest movements that are happening right now, let alone to support them sometimes, and to really get behind them, is because we have such a sort of blinkered understanding of history, right? If you don't know why people in communities of color are concerned about law enforcement, right? Not only are you not paying attention to the present, but you don't understand the history, right? Because I hear this all the time. Very otherwise, some of them very well-intended white people, I'm sure, saying, why do black people have such a thing about the cops? Why don't they listen to police? Why don't they do what they're told? Why don't they just obey authority, right? Which is a really easy thing to say when you've always been the authority, right? Telling other people to obey authority works well when you've always been the one to whom they had to pay some form of obedience, right? But it also suggests you don't know the history, right? Because if you knew the history, you wouldn't ask that question. If you knew the history, you would understand why black and brown folks sometimes run from the cops, right? In fact, the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts just ruled, this was interesting, These are mostly white folks, and they just ruled in a case about a month ago that, in fact, it makes sense for black men to run from police. This is the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts. There was a case, right, where the cops had arrested some guy because he ran from them. And I guess I don't know if they found something on him or not, right? I don't really remember, but they arrested him and they were trying to defend, I think they did, they might have found like a low level of drugs. They were trying to defend the search that they did because he ran, and the court said, no, it's not a legal search because black folks have a perfectly rational reason to try to get away from cops even if they don't have anything on them. That's the Supreme Court of the state of Massachusetts said that. That's pretty heavy, right? Because what they're saying is there's a context to the behavior. It may not be rational for people who don't have that history to run from cops, right? It wouldn't make sense. If you haven't had that history, that might be a little suspicious, right? Like if white folks start taking off running from cops, yeah, you might want to run their ass down because they're probably up to something, right? You need to set up a barricade and some spike strips in the road or something because they're doing something. But black folks might just be trying to not get brutalized today, right? Because that's what we see happen. Eric Garner got choked out on the streets of Staten Island. He wasn't doing anything but hanging out, supposedly selling loose cigarettes, which they never actually could prove, by the way. They didn't find any loose cigarettes on him, nor could they find anyone to whom he had sold one, but they said he was selling them, and of course that's a capital offense on Staten Island, apparently. So he gets choked out, not resisting at all, just giving a little lip to the officer, which you would do too if you were getting harassed for no reason, right? Tamir Rice wasn't doing anything but playing with a toy gun in a park in Cleveland, something white boys do every day in this country without fear of being shot dead by a cop, let alone having the cop do it and then lie about it, which is what he did. You see the videotape for yourself. This officer said, what, that I rolled up on Tamir Rice and I gave him 3 warnings to drop his weapon, and he didn't. He pointed it at me. Now, the tape makes it clear that's not true. The car stops, and within a second and a half, Tamir Rice's body drops. He never pulled the gun, the toy gun, out of his waistband, because let's just be, like, why would he do that? Like, putting aside the fact that we've got proof that's not what happened, why the hell would a kid point a toy gun at a cop whom he knows has a real gun? I mean, just even the logic of that, right? It suggests that we actually believe as a country that black people are so irrational that they think they can play cops and robbers with cops, right? And live to tell about it. It doesn't make any sense, but lots of people believed it, and this officer wasn't indicted. John Crawford was dropped in a Walmart in Beaver Creek, Ohio, right outside of Dayton, right? And a cop lied there too. Comes around the corner. He got called, first of all, by a guy in the Walmart. White dude sees John Crawford. He got an air rifle. Air rifle. Not a lethal weapon, air rifle that they sell at Walmart. Got it off of a shelf, and he's standing there in the aisle with it. He's sort of leaning on it, sort of swinging it by his side. Maybe he's going to buy it. I don't know. Maybe he just thought it was cool, and he's walking around. I don't know. Who knows? He's on the phone with his girlfriend or fiance or whatever, and some white dude sees him with the air rifle. Oh, God, 911. There's a black guy with an afro at the Walmart. He's got a gun. Okay, first of all, it's not an afro, it's twist, so get our black hair straight. Please get your black hair straight. Keep saying shit like that. Some black dude with an afro on aisle 7 is about to get blasted, and he didn't even do anything. He didn't even have the air rifle. He just had the wrong hair. Just get your black hair straight. And please, white people, can we do that without touching black hair? That would be good, too. Can we do... You don't have to touch it. You don't have to touch it to know the difference. Just Google that shit. Like that. Just Google that shit. That's what the internet is for, right? Research. You don't have to touch it, right? But this guy calls the cops on John Crawford. This dude blasts in. He comes in the door. You got video of him coming through the door. Big burly cop with a gun, looking for the guy, right? Comes around the corner, opens fire immediately. He didn't give Crawford a warning. He said he did. He's a liar. Right? Says he gave him a warning. He didn't. He opens fire. Crawford drops. He wasn't dead yet, though, so he stands back up. He's probably in a daze, like, what the hell's happening? There's a shooting at the Walmart. This is crazy. What's happening? He didn't even reach for the air rifle, of course, because it's got no bullets. Why would he? Right? He doesn't reach for it, although the cop said he did. Oh, he pointed it at me. Again, pointed an air rifle at a cop with a real gun who already shot him once. That doesn't even begin to make sense, and it's not true. The tape says it's not true. The cop shoots 4 or 5 more times. Crawford dies. Once again, this cop is not indicted, is not prosecuted, is free today. I should also point out this particular officer is the only officer in the history of the Beaver Creek, Ohio Police Department to kill anyone in the line of duty, and John Crawford was the second one he killed. Didn't go to jail either time. Oh, and the guy that killed Tamir Rice had been released from a previous police department for being too unstable to carry a weapon, but that didn't stop him from being hired in Cleveland. So there's a reason black folks are not quick to trust police. And there's a reason why black folks can fear, and not just black folks, people of color generally fear police. I mean, Mexican-American folk in the Los Angeles area have family that remember the Zoot Suit riots in '43. They know what cops and military did, rampaging through Mexican-American communities in that city, tearing shit up just because they could, and they had a badge, and they had a uniform. They had the backing of the United States government, right? So it isn't even just black folks. There's a history, but if we haven't learned that, and we haven't, right? Like, how many of us who are white learned any of that history of police brutality? And how many of us understand the direct line connection between modern-day policing and slave patrols? Because that's the first time policing was really used in our country. In the late early 1700s, right, we create the slave patrols to keep black folks in line. We put these working-class white men on horses, give them a badge and a gun, right, and tell them to check the ID of black people, make sure they're not runaway slaves, right? You're going to keep those folks in line. So there's a direct line connection, not only because that was the first kind of policing, but because notice the class status of those on the slave patrol. Piss poor, working class, don't have nothing white folks. That's still who gets to be cops today, isn't it? Rich people don't police stuff. Rich people hire poor people to police stuff and protect their shit. That's what rich people do. Just like rich people don't go to war, rich people get poor people to go to war for them, to protect their stuff. So working class folks getting used, right, as frontline fodder, getting sent into situations, right, that are in fact oftentimes dangerous, but then they get mad at the people they're being asked to police rather than the system that's demanding they be policed. And a system that's creating such inequality and anger that they might need to be, in certain cases, policed because they are pissed, because the system is jacking people around. So then you just use these working class white folks as fodder, right? And so, of course, people of color understand that history, but most of us who are white don't. I wasn't taught it in high school, and I took AP history. Hell, that's the history for smart people, right? That's what they say. AP history, that's the history for y'all, you people that can handle it. That's the hard shit, right? And then they didn't teach us anything about that, though. So if you don't know that history, when black folks are insisting, for instance, Black Lives Matter, then we get all twisted. We get all bent, twisted out of shape. All lives matter. I know, precious. I know. I got those two little girls, 13 and 15. You think I don't love them and think that their lives, I know that their lives matter. You don't need to tell me that. I didn't forget that, right? But here's the difference. The whole system knows that my daughter's lives matter. All the cops know it. All the employers know it, their teachers know it, the whole society says it in a million different ways. We don't have to repeat it, that's redundant, right? People of color, on the other hand, are saying, sometimes y'all forget us, so we just want to make sure you know that when you say all, we're going to make sure you remember that some of us are part of that all, and sometimes you forget that, right? Because we have a long history of saying all, don't we, and not meaning it, right? Thomas Jefferson said, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oddly enough, when he wrote it, he didn't mean it. Didn't mean all, right? The last words of the pledge say what? Liberty and justice for all. There's that word again. But when that was written, the folks who wrote it didn't mean it. That's why some folks are taking a knee, because they didn't mean it. They didn't mean it. They still don't mean it. Right? You can say all and it doesn't mean anything. So Black Lives Matter is a way of putting like an asterisk, right, at the end of the word all. It's like when you see all lives matter, it's like asterisk. Yeah, but we need you to remember that we're part of that, right? But we get all twisted because we don't understand. If you have a history, a system that's always said that black lives don't matter, and we could say the same thing about brown lives and just indigenous lives generally, like people of color lives. If you have a system that's always denigrated those lives, you sort of got to point that out. You have to specify that which has been ignored. You don't have to specify that which is taken for granted. Going back to the White History Month example, you don't have to name it because it's taken for granted and we know we're going to learn it. You don't have to be specific that way, right? But that's about historical ignorance. It's about a lack of historical memory, right? It's about not understanding sort of how we got here and where we came from. But if unarmed black folks are, as they are, 3.5 times more likely than unarmed white folks nationwide to be shot by law enforcement, that's a study that looked at thousands, over 10,000 county-level data. 3.5 times more likely unarmed black folks relative to unarmed white folks, not attacking, not in the act of posing a direct threat to the officers. In some communities, it's worse. In Los Angeles County, it's actually 20 to 1. 20 to 1 odds, unarmed black to unarmed white being shot. In New Orleans, where I lived for 10 years, it's between 10 and 12 to 1, right? So some communities are even worse. Nationwide average, 3.5 to 1. So that's why folks have to say Black Lives Matter, and that's why folks, right, have to have a different way of looking at law enforcement, because For them, cops were not the people that came and got the cat out of the tree, right? They're not the folks that came and gave little Billy a ride around in the neighborhood to show him how gosh darn exciting it was to be an officer, right? Right? It was William Parker, right? Chief Parker in Los Angeles, for whom Parker Center is named, right? Inveterate bigot. Such a bigot that he used to actually recruit Klansmen to be in his police department. He used to go to the South. He didn't even pick like California Klansmen, of whom there were plenty. He was like, nah, I'm going to the source. I'm going to the well, the mainspring of this. And he would go to the South and recruit white guys from the South to come out here and work in the LAPD, right? And see, black folks in LA know that. That's not revelatory to black folks who've been out here for more than a minute, but to a lot of white folks, it's like, well, Dragnet was a great show. I don't know what you're talking about. My goodness, right? We don't have that experience. And it's not our fault that we don't know it, but there is something wrong about a system that doesn't require that we know it. Because how are you going to understand your world if you don't understand that, right? So denial, entitlement, a lack of historical memory. But let me explain how dangerous this is, because that's how I want to close this up before I take some questions. See, we could say all that and say, well, gosh, that's horrible and that's a shame. But this isn't just an academic or intellectual exercise I'm trying to explain here. I'm trying to point out something that's really critical. It's not just people of color that suffer when that ignorance is allowed to be tolerated and sustained. A lot of times, when we do anti-racism work, there is that persistent question, right, that even, the best of us have when we do the work and we think we've done a good job of it, we still are like, oh, even the most long-standing activists are sort of look at each other and we go, oh, damn, but why would white people want to give all that up if they have advantages, right? I mean, if the typical white family's got 15 times the net worth of the typical black family, which is true, the typical white family has 13 times the net worth of the typical Latino family, which is true. If the typical white family headed by a high school dropout has twice the net worth of the typical black family headed by a college graduate, which is true, by the way, then why would white folks want to go back to something different, or go forward, I should say, to something different? That's why people get freaked out at the idea of progress for people of color, because we're thinking, oh my God, that comes at our expense, right? So if they make moves forward, then we're going to fall backward, and that's where we get this whole Make America Great Again, retrospective, nostalgic view of America. Let's go back to the way it was back in the good old days, right? But I want to suggest to you that the irony of that stance is that, in fact, it's not healthy even for white people, right? That nostalgia and the inequality that nostalgia rationalizes and makes a positive social good is actually dangerous for white people. And here's how I'm going to make that case to you. Real quick history lesson, then a few contemporary points. Do we understand, and if we don't, we should, because again, this is not in the AP history class, let alone standard history. You don't even learn it in college most of the time. Do we understand how the white race came to exist? And that sounds like a weird thing to say, because people are like, what do you mean? We've always existed. No, there is no such thing as the white race until the 1600s. There's a very specific reason for which it was created, and you need to know what that is. When I say there was no such thing as the white race, I don't mean there wasn't such thing as people of European descent. I'm just saying we didn't call ourselves that. We didn't consider ourselves one big happy family. Are you kidding? Why? Europeans spent most of our time killing each other in the old countries, right? That's what we did. We didn't like each other. The Anglo didn't like the Irish didn't like the Anglo, Germans didn't like anybody, right? Northern Italians didn't like Southern Italians, didn't even think people from Sicily were Italian, thought they were Mediterranean or North African peoples, right? So Europeans spent all that time hating each other. We weren't one big happy family, one big tribe, one big team. We just killed each other and spent the rest of the time trying to figure out who the witch was. So when we come to the colonies from all these different places, we didn't call ourselves white. That's an invention. About middle of the 1600s, middle of the 17th century, right? All of a sudden, why? Now, and why would that happen then? Why would it be important to create this thing called the white race and start referring to all Europeans by that term in law and books and custom and education and common conversation? Well, what reason is because around that time, there were a handful of really rich people that owned everything, right? Handful of landowners that owned all the property and were really the rich, and everybody else was a peasant. They were either African indentured servants. This is before lifetime enslavement really came to be a thing around the 1640s. For the first 20 or 30 years of the colonial experiment, most Africans were not really technically enslaved the way we think of enslaved people. They were indentured servants, as were thousands of piss poor Europeans, right? And what they had to do was they had a contract for like 7 years or for 11 years, and you had to work it off, and after that period of time, you'd be set free from your terms of indenture. And so it was virtual slavery, but not quite what we think of and what came to be chattel slavery after that. So you got all these peasants, they don't have anything. They're all getting screwed by the rich guy who owns all the land. At some point, the rich guys get together and they're like, I don't think this con's gonna work forever. Like, we cannot pull this shit off indefinitely. Eventually, they are gonna figure out the game and they are gonna jack our stuff. So what do? We gotta expand our team, right? And we don't intend to expand it by redistributing our stuff and making everybody middle class, and now we're all one big happy family. No. We want to keep our stuff. We don't want them to have it, so we've got to make our team bigger by creating a buffer between us and the people at the bottom. What are we going to do? We're going to take those poor Europeans and we're going to start calling them white. We're going to make them think they're part of the team. We're going to allow them the right to enter into contracts, the right to testify in court. At least for the men, we're going to let them own a little property, not much, but just a little bit, give them a taste of power. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude for white people. We're going to move to chattel slavery for black people. And we're going to put those poor white folks on the slave patrol to keep black people in line, make them think that they're part of our team, and it worked. Even though there had been several cross-color rebellions against the elite in the colonial period, most prominently perhaps Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, although that's not the only one. Once these laws and customs change and we start thinking of the white race as a thing, those rebellions stop because now the poor European thinks that they're in league with the rich guy, right? It's a trick, divide and conquer, right? And it didn't really help those poor Europeans, did it? It gave them a taste of power, but they still were despised by the rich. They still had the hardest jobs. They still had less life expectancy. They still didn't have any real wealth, right? Fast forward to the period where the Confederacy breaks away from the Union, right? Folks where I'm from in the South break away, and the rich at that time were open about why they were doing it. Man, the rich white folks stood up and said, we are leaving the Union because we want to maintain white supremacy and our interest in the ownership of other human beings. That's what they said. My people lie about it now. And we say, oh, well, it's not about slavery. No. It was about states' rights. What right do you think they were fighting over? Do you think South Carolina was fighting with Pennsylvania about the best barbecue recipe? Is that what the fight was about? Right? It wasn't the right to determine the proper recipe for a mint julep, right? It was the right to own human beings. Georgia wanted it, Pennsylvania didn't. South Carolina wanted it, and Massachusetts didn't. Right? And that was the problem. They wouldn't return the runaways. That was the problem. You're not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. Right? The Constitution says you got to give us our people back when they run away. Right? States' rights. Yeah, but what about the right of Massachusetts not to return your property when it runs away? What about the right of Pennsylvania to say, no, in this state, this is not owned property, this is a human being. So you don't believe in states' rights, or you would extend to those states the right to actually enforce their laws. So they lied. It was about white supremacy. It was about, we're lying now. Back then, they didn't lie because they had no shame. Back then, they just said it. Alexander Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy, says, the cornerstone of our new government is the great truth that the Negro is not the equal of the white man. That's what he said. Didn't talk about trade policy, didn't talk about tariffs, didn't talk about states' rights as some abstract moral principle. He talked about the ownership of human beings and white supremacy as a system. Right? Now, here's the trick, though. Rich white folks admitting that's the reason they want to go to war. But like I said before, rich people don't fight their own wars. They get poor people to do that. So now they got to tell all these poor white folks that don't own anything that you got to go to war to build up our stuff and keep our stuff. Why would you do that, right? That's weird, right? I mean, it's weird. I'm not rich, but I got a nice house, and most of y'all are students, so I probably have more than you, most likely. And yet if somebody were to invade my block next week, like an army, was like rolling up on my block in Nashville, Tennessee, and I got on the phone and called y'all, even if y'all liked the speech, and most of you seem to, and I were to say, hey, there's an invasion on my block, but I don't feel like fighting. I'm going to hang out on the back porch and have a drink. I'd like for y'all to come and fight to protect my shit. You're probably going to be like, love you, but no, right? So the rich had to figure out a way to tell the poor and convince them to go and do that for them. How do you do it? They looked at him and they said, in effect, well, if these black people get free, it's going to threaten our way of life. Our way of life? The hell, whose way of life? Rich people are riding around in carriages with parasols at 2 p.m. because they don't have any damn work to do. Poor white folks are sweating it out, doing jobs every day. So whose way of life are we protecting? They're having balls and cotillions and parties, sitting around going, what do people do for labor? I don't know. My goodness, what do we do? You know, look at the black people picking all the cotton. I wish I had a job. I mean, they didn't do anything, right? Our way of life. Poor white folks were having to work 12, 15 hours a day. Rich white folks sitting around doing nothing and then constructing the idea that it's the black people who are lazy. That's what psychologists call projection, right? Sitting there having my mint julep. Look at those lazy people. You know, give me another. You know, right? And so at some point, the poor fall for it, though. Because the rich are saying if they get free, they're going to take your job. Well, no. See, that's the problem. They sort of already have your job, don't they? Because if you're a white person and you have to charge, like, I don't know, $1 a week, whatever the going rate was at the time, to pick the cotton or to harvest the tobacco or to work in the blacksmith shop or whatever it was that enslaved people were doing in a given community, if you have to charge $1 a week for that, and I can get the enslaved person to do it for nothing because I own them, guess who gets the job? The one that's free, right? People like free, right? They'll hire free when they own them before they have to pay your white ass. And so in a sense, poor white folks were made worse off. The wage floor for working class white people is actually bid downward by the existence of enslavement. But it did what? It did what W.E.B. Du Bois called build up the psychological wage of whiteness, right? Because it said in effect that every white man, no matter how low, was still above any black person, no matter how high. So it took white folks and said, you may not have much, but at least you're not black. And later on, you may not have much, but at least you're not Mexican. You may not have much, but at least you're not Chinese labor working on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. You may not have much, but at least you're not fill in the blank, right? And so it was a trick, divide and conquer, but it worked. White folks would have been better off at the bottom, and in the middle would have been better off joining in solidarity with enslaved people to overthrow the system, but they got jacked and tricked. And then fast forward to the union movement, this trick has been going on now for so long that by the 1920s and 30s, you got white labor leaders, right, who were saying, well, we can't integrate our union. What do you mean? Black people in our union, Mexicans, Chinese, what? We can't integrate our union. If we integrate our union, it'll reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, it will double the size of your union, which might really be helpful when you go on strike, right? More people on the strike line generally helps as opposed to fewer. And here's the real kicker. If you don't bring the people of color into your craft and put them in the union and work side by side with them, when you go on strike, guess who the boss hires to replace you? The very people of color you refuse to work next to. And then he does that knowing that you will blame them for taking your job as opposed to the boss for giving your job away so that y'all keep at each other's throats fighting over the piece of the pie that not one of you owns. So when we talk about why white folks might want to rethink this thing, right? Why we might want to rethink our attachment to white supremacy, why we want to rethink our attachment to the psychological wage, because when was the last time a psychological wage paid your mortgage or your rent? You can't pay a hospital bill with that. You can't put a kid through college with a psychological wage. You're not going to take that as currency. You got to have a real wage for that. You got to have real money for that. And folks have been sacrificing real money just so they could build themselves up here and believe that they were superior. And that's what that wall's about. Build a wall? For what? Just build a wall. A big, beautiful wall like you've never seen. A wall like you wouldn't believe. I don't even know what the hell that means. What is a wall like I've never seen? Like, I've seen lots of kind of walls. They got brick walls, they got stucco walls, right? They got mud walls, right? Cement walls. I mean, unless it's like a butter wall. Is that what maybe that's what he means, a big, beautiful butter wall, right? I don't know. Like, what does that mean? A wall like, and then people are like, yeah, build it so that I can get my job back. And I'll get more money every Friday. You would think that's how that works. You build a wall, and it's like now the employers are, hell. You know, they built that wall. I got to give you a raise now. You think that's what employers do? Employers are like, shit, you figured this out. If it wasn't for that wall, we could still screw you. But now that there's a wall, okay, you get a bonus. No, that's not what bosses do, because, you know, that wall's not going to stop the boss from moving the factory. Right? The wall doesn't stop capital. What do you think, the wall is like in cyberspace, like a firewall on a computer? And then you're like, you go to your bank account and I'm going to transfer $1 billion to the Cayman Islands. Boop. Oh, bing, hit the wall. Damn. Damn that wall. Damn that Trump. right? I can't move my money. No, the money will always be able to move. The wall doesn't stop capital. Capital's always going to be able to cross borders, right? In search of the highest rate on return. Goods are always going to be able to cross borders in search of the highest the highest price. But if you allow capital to move and goods to move, but you chain labor to its country of origin, you inherently tilt the game in favor of the rich. That's Econ 101. You benefit capital by definition at the expense of working people, not just working people south of the border, but all working people, because now they aren't able to join in solidarity in a larger confederation to try to fight for better working conditions, wages, et cetera, and benefits for all working people. So there's a lot of reasons why white folks might want to rethink this attachment, right? We're seeing it right now with health care. It's interesting, isn't it, to watch the states that are about to have these really big increases in healthcare costs. California will probably actually come out all right compared to most states, right? And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why California and states like Connecticut, states like New York, right, actually aren't going to have the kind of healthcare rate increases that some of the other states, including like all the southern states, where I live in Tennessee, right? I'm going to have, my rates are going through the roof. I can tell you right now. My family, because we're in the private pay market, right? Most people who get health care get it through an employer or they get it through Medicare or Medicaid. And there's only like 4, 5, maybe 6% who have to like have your own private pay policy. And that's the group that's going to get hit the most. And so my rate's probably going to double. Here's the thing about that though, right? Number one, just as a side note, I don't have any right to complain about that. Because as much as I don't like having to pay that much more for the premium, let's be clear, the only reason my premiums were low before the ACA, before so-called Obamacare, was because, in effect, my family was being subsidized by the ability of companies to screw people and let them die and not cover them. And I didn't have the right to have my price artificially restricted by the right of people to die without health care, right? For me to say, well, how dare they raise my rates, is to say we ought to go back to a time when companies could make more profits because they could just screw you and not cover you. I don't think that's a moral position, so I'll pay what I have to pay. But more importantly, the reason that my rates are going to go up, and some other folks, particularly in states like Tennessee and like Kentucky and like South Carolina and all the states of the old Confederacy, is because those are the exact states that didn't set up state exchanges and didn't expand the Medicaid pool. Remember, the purpose of the ACA was to expand the Medicaid pool in every state, right, so that the truly poor who were probably in worse health would be in the government risk pool. And it would be a large sort of pool that would keep the cost down, which is what Medicare and Medicaid both do. But the southern states, and a few non-southern, but the southern states didn't want to expand Medicaid. Oh, no. Why? Well, because those people will take advantage of the system. Oh, now what's the irony? First of all, who are those people? We know what they mean. So that's racial bias. You saying those brown people, those black people are going to take advantage. So the very states that didn't expand Medicaid then ended up what? Those black and brown poor folks, and white poor folks for that matter, were kept in the larger risk pool rather than being put in the more managed government pool. Which means if they're in the same risk pool that I'm in and they've got worse health, it's going to be harder for the companies to make profit trying to insure them and trying to insure me, so they have to get the extra money out of me. The irony being white folks who are experiencing that all through the South are experiencing that because of the racism of their state lawmakers who didn't want to cover black and brown people. See, that is how white supremacy doubles back on your ass, right? When you're white. That's why white folks are, and we're going to complain. Oh, it's Obama. Thanks, Obama. My rates are going up. Yeah, because your white lawmakers, white reactionary lawmakers, didn't want to cover people of color for fear they would screw the program and take advantage of it, and now your white ass doesn't have health care either or can't afford the new rate hikes. And you're still blaming the black guy who tried to make them give it to you. And then the white folks are like, you can't make me. Right? It's like the guy during the Tea Party stuff, right, during the debate on the health care reform. They had these folks rallying in D.C., Tea Party folks rallying on the Mall in Washington to stop health care reform. Tens of thousands of people go to Washington to stop people from getting health care. It's fascinating, the stuff that people protest, right? So they show up, and they got these folks out there with microphones and cameras. They got this one white guy I remember seeing in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask, right, and like a fake leg, something, coughing up phlegm. You know, clearly like on his last leg, man, literally and figuratively, right? Right? I mean, this guy's in bad shape, right? And they put the mic in his face and they're like, you want health care? And he's like, yeah. He said, well, do you have any? No, but I don't want the government to provide it. All right, dude, look, if folks come down from Neptune right now and offer you health care, you need to take that shit, because you got about 5 minutes. In about 5 minutes, you're going to have a stroke, man. You're about to have a heart attack. You're just going to pop right here in front of the cameras and explode, and you're arguing over who wants to give you health care, right? This black guy's trying to make sure you don't die, and you're like, no, thank you. Don't tread on me. What the hell, you know? I mean, really, you know, and we joke about it because sometimes you have to laugh so you don't cry about the absurdity of some of this, right? This humor is not intended to dismiss the severity of it. It's to say, good God, do we see the ridiculousness of this, not only for people of color for whom it's deadly serious, but even for white folks. Like, this attachment to this system is literally killing white people. There was a study that came out at the end of the year last year. You might have seen it. 2 Princeton economists, 1 Nobel Prize winner, right? And they released this study that, it was fascinating. They were looking at the mortality data, death rates, right, essentially, for different groups from 1999 to 2013. And normally, just so you know, in case you didn't, if you're in a modern, industrial, advanced economy, normally the mortality rates are going down, right? People are living longer, medical interventions are saving lives, infant mortality is dropping, life expectancy is increasing. So normally the trajectory is downward, which is a good thing. Now, it's higher for some groups than others, right? So people of color generally higher mortality than whites, poor people higher mortality than rich people, obviously. But what was interesting was, and that trend, the normal trend, held for every demographic group except one subgroup. So people of color, their trajectory was good, going in the right direction, right? Women generally, but specifically of color, their trajectory was going in the right direction. Still too high by far, but still going in the right direction. Poor folks, truly poor folks, their trajectory too high, but going in the right direction. The only group that had this weird spike, like the exact opposite of the normal trend, this huge jump over that 14-year period, enough to explain 500,000 excess deaths, compared to what would have happened if their trend had continued in the same direction, were white, middle-aged, non-college educated, working class people, mostly men, also women. Disproportionately men, but also women. Now think about it. Oh, and by the way, their excess deaths weren't just like, oh, I died in my sleep. Their excess deaths were driven by 3 types of problems. One were opioid addiction overdoses, right? Heroin and or legal oxy and other types of heroin or heroin-similar opiates. Second thing was cirrhosis of the liver, which is brought on principally by heavy drinking. And the third thing were suicide, right? So in other words, self-inflicted injury and death was driving this jump in mortality. Now, why would working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks, especially men, be killing themselves directly or indirectly in such large numbers in that period, while people of color who were also middle-aged, also working class, also non-college educated, kept getting healthier? Seems a little weird, especially considering that those people of color who are non-college educated, working class, and middle-aged tend to still be worse off than the white folks who are. They're all struggling, but you know, the black and brown folks in that group usually are more likely to be out of work, far more likely to be poor, have less net worth, right? So what's the explanation? And the researchers didn't necessarily offer one, but some of us have thought about it since, and the only logical explanation I can come to, right, is that for those white folks that reach middle age and found themselves really struggling to survive, right, white, working class, middle age, non-college educated, especially men, to look around and see the economic floor sort of shifting beneath them, because these are people that what? They'd always been told, all you got to do is work hard, right? You just work hard, play by the rules, keep your nose clean, double down on the work effort, work over the weekends, don't take vacations, save money, everything will be fine. You'll be able to pass something down to your kids better than what you had. And these guys believed it. Why? Because they had the privilege of believing it, because they were white men, right? Because if you're white, you had the privilege of believing that stuff. No person of color did. People of color never thought that all they had to do was work hard. Black and brown folks knew that working hard wasn't going to be enough, playing by the rules wasn't going to be enough. So by the time black and brown folks got to middle age and are still struggling, they didn't get knocked off stride by that because they never bought into the myth. That's the irony of privilege. Privilege tells you to believe something that isn't true. And 364 days out of the year that works. And if day 365 is a day you get the pink slip, the other 364 days don't matter. right? If you have the luxury of believing the system works and then all of a sudden you find out it doesn't, if they told you all your life all you're going to need is a strong back and the ability to lift things, you don't need to go to college, you just got to have a strong back. People of color knew that wasn't always a guarantee of anything, but these white men were convinced because for their daddy it was true, and for his daddy it was true, and for his daddy it was true, and for his daddy it was true. And now it's not because the economy changed. And we as a country didn't feel the need to invest in those people any more than we did black and brown folks to actually make sure they were ready for the transition. But that ain't black folks' fault, and that's not Mexican folks' fault, and that's not Asian folks' fault, and that's not Native folks' fault. That's the white guys that run the economy, who benefit the most from it, who didn't see the need to actually provide a safety net or a floor beneath those white folks either, right? And so now they don't know how to cope because if you never had to build up your coping skills and your resilience, you didn't do it, see? Not to romanticize suffering, because there's nothing romantic about it. But at least those who've had to suffer for a long time know how to suffer. And those who know how to overcome know how to overcome. And those who know how to survive know how to survive. And if you never had to worry about surviving before, you do not know. This is why, during the Great Depression, ask yourself, who jumped off the tallest buildings in New York? You've heard those stories, right? The stock market crashes in 1929. Who do you think went up to the highest buildings in New York City and threw their asses off of them? You think black folks did that? You think black folks in Harlem were like, shit, the stock market tanked? I am out. You think poor white people downtown on the Bowery, right, in poor white neighborhoods, you think they climbed up to the top of the building and said, my stock is useless? Poor white folks didn't have any stock. They just got in the soup line, right? It was rich folks. Rich folks were like, oh, I've lost everything. I got to jump, right? Poor folks, white and black, were like, well, why don't you just come get some soup? We got soup. There's plenty of soup. Rich folks were like, I don't want soup. I want to die because I'm not rich anymore. See, privilege creates some really thin skin, doesn't it? See, it's not all it's cracked up to be. It's really good in relative terms, but if that day is the day, see, you're just not ready. So there's a reason why we need to fight this thing. And it's not about charity. It's not about saving the other, right? It's about realizing that for the vast majority of us, unless you're one of those 1/10 of 1%, 1/100th of 1% of the population that owns pretty much everything, right? Because we got like 30 people in this country. And if any of y'all are among them, don't even let me know. It just depress me, right? 30 people in this country that own as much as the bottom half of the country. 165 million people here, 30 people here, and they own the same amount of stuff, right? Do we think that those 30 people are just that smart? Like, they work that much harder, they got that much collective IQ, more than 165? I doubt it. I doubt it, right? So we got a system of inequalities not working for just about anybody, right? Including 99.99% of the white folks. It's not really working for. So we better figure this out. We don't have a lot of time, right? California is already mostly people of color. The whole country is going to be half and half in about 30 years or less. Within 30 years, half the country is going to be people of color, half white. We can't be a sustained economy with this level of disparity and inequality. How are you going to maintain a healthy economy for anybody's babies, anybody's grandchildren, anybody's families, if you have half the population twice as likely as the other half to be unemployed? Half the population 3 times as likely as the other half to be poor. Half the population 1/15 the net worth of the other half. Half the population double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight babies, 9 years less life expectancy on average. I would say that is not a recipe for economic success. It's a recipe for utter disaster. It's a recipe for complete and utter catastrophe. So this thing we call racial justice that people are fighting for all around this country, man, that's not charity work. That is radical, profound self-help. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll take a few questions, and then I'll let you get out of here. I do have some books, by the way, for people who would like to buy one. I'm a horrible salesperson. Like, I could talk about racism forever, but then I get all shy about, like, I've got some shit to sell you. If you want to buy it, great. If not, that's totally cool too. I won't take it personally, but I have kids to put through college, so, buy if you want to buy. I have 2 books, actually, for sale. One is Under the Affluence, the most recent book, and the other is Dear White America. I've got them both in the back when we're done. But if you have a question, I'll take it. I think we have some mics to...
I have a question.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tim. It was awesome.
Thank you.
My question is, what was the inspiration, the motivation for you getting involved in this work in the first place?
Well, it's a multi-step process. I'll give you the short version. First, of course, is not so much what gave me the motivation, but what allowed me to have some, perhaps, insight into the way that race plays out in the country. Goes back to childhood. I went to a historically black college for preschool, so my earliest childhood education experience at the age of 3 and 4 was at Tennessee State University in Nashville in a class where I was one of maybe 3 not black people. And my mom put me there very specifically to sort of socialize me in a non-dominant environment and to sort of prepare me for the integrated school system that I was going to be in, but that she never had the benefit and the luxury of being in, having graduated from that same school, or having been in that school system for most of her life, graduated elsewhere, but had been there through her sophomore year and junior year. So I went to TSU, and what that meant was that first my peer group was going to be mostly black kids, so that when I got into first grade, second grade, and let me be clear, I'm not saying like, oh, I had black friends, because we all say that shit and we're usually lying. But what I mean is, like, I didn't have anything but black friends. Like, early on, that was sort of it, right? That was my crew. It's who I hung out with, who I played ball with, who I sat in the lunchroom with, all that. And what that meant was that when those kids started to get treated differently, which happened, I mean, within weeks of first grade starting, right? I was going to notice that, at least at some level, right? Because those were my friends. And so I'm noticing, like, oh, they're being put on that side of the room and learning this material, and me and these white people I've never seen before are over here doing this other material, and I really want to be over there with my friends, or I want them to be over here with me. And I didn't know what it was. I mean, I was pretty smart for a 5- and 6-year-old, but it's not like I rolled up at home that first week and was like, Mom, I saw some institutional white supremacy today. I wasn't that smart. But I knew something was happening, and you file it away, right? You sort of get a sense of it, and you start to notice it, and later on you can make sense of it. So it heightens your awareness. Second thing being at TSU did, of course, was it subordinated me to black authority, because the women that ran that program were mostly African-American women. And it was in North Nashville, the historically black part of town. So every day, I'm being subordinated to black authority, which at the age of 3 in Nashville, Tennessee, or anywhere else, not only in 1971 and 2, but anywhere in America even today, is pretty rare for a white person to be subordinated to black authority at that age, but I was. Those women could have put me out and would have not hesitated to do so if I'd gotten out of hand. So what that meant was I learned to respect black authority, right? And to question it no more or less than any other authority. I mean, anybody in a position of authority can abuse it. But the problem is, in our country, we tend to respect white authority and dismiss black authority. And I was learning at a really early age not to do that. So that means that when I get to be in my mid-20s, after I graduated from college and started doing community work and community organizing in New Orleans, in public housing, in communities that were virtually all black and all poor by definition, pretty much, and I'm working with black women mostly, I'm going back to that early imprinting which said, oh yeah, these people actually know what the hell they're talking about, right? So when they tell you something, don't be the white guy that's like, are you sure? I think you could be seeing things, right? I wasn't going to be that guy because I had learned to respect black authority when I'm 3 and 4. So when they tell me about their lives, I'm going to be the one that's like, wow, I need to get involved in that. That's messed up. We got to do something, right? And so that was critical. So that's the awareness piece. Later, of course, there's lots of other stuff that happens. But again, to make the story as short as I can, I go to Tulane in New Orleans for college. I'm doing anti-apartheid work at that time around South African apartheid because that was the big thing in the 80s, trying to get our schools to divest from companies that were complicit with white minority rule in South Africa. And there were some really good activists in the city of New Orleans who came around to Tulane, where we white folks mainly were doing that work. I mean, there were black folks involved in the struggle, but the people like myself who got a lot of prominence and a lot of attention were white activists. And they were real patient sometimes not so patient, just sort of tapping us on the shoulder and saying, hey, this is great what you're doing here about this racism thing 8,000 miles away, and we're glad you're doing it, and keep doing it. Meanwhile, we'd like for you to give a little thought to the racism that's going on down the block, right, and the stuff that's happening here. And once you have enough people tell you that and sort of make you draw the connections, right, you start to see it. And then the final thing was I graduated college in 1990. That was the year David Duke ran for the United States Senate. David Duke, former Klan leader, lifelong white supremacist neo-Nazi, and he was running, and I was involved in the campaigns against him when he ran for Senate, and then when he ran for governor in '91. And of course, he lost both of those elections, thankfully, but, no thanks to white people. Because had it been up to white folks, he would have won either or both of them. 60% of white people voted for him when he ran for the U.S. Senate, even though they knew he was a Nazi. Everybody knew he was a Nazi. It wasn't a secret. There were people in utero that knew he was a Nazi, right? Like 6-month-old fetuses were like, Nazi, And in 1991, when he ran for governor, 55% of white folks voted for him. So black folks saved us both times. And I remember when that happened, like a lot of my colleagues, right, sitting around all trying to process what that meant. What does that mean for us, particularly those of us who were white in the movement? What does that mean that basically 6 out of 10 white people voted for a Nazi, right? And, on the one hand, I knew it wasn't that 6 out of 10 white people were Nazis. Again, like I said, I've been white a long time. I know that 6 out of 10 white people are not actually legit white supremacist Nazi-type Klan members. But we were willing to vote for one, and we had to struggle with what that meant. And what I came to recognize in that moment was we just couldn't keep asking black people to save us. We just can't keep asking people of color to rush in and save the day. We got to do that. We like to preach self-help to other people. We just don't like to do it for ourselves. And so that was my job. I realized in that moment that's my job, is to work with my people and to struggle with other white folks in particular around understanding our implication in the system and our interest in getting free from the system. And so all of those things combined sort of produced this thing that I became, and I guess that's a good thing. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm certainly glad to be doing what I'm doing and be in concert with so many others. Other questions, please. Yes.
Hi, Tim.
Hey.
My name's Sal.
Yep.
My question is, do you think a big reason for the maintaining of the status quo for white America would be this fear of being ashamed of their history? Because when I see like white allies who are compassionate, that's great. I love that. But there is also this like lack of shame of like one's history. And the example I have of that is the desegregation in America.
Yeah.
While everyone thought, the South was desegregated, a lot of the northern states were still segregated. Malcolm X said that about New York. If you wanted to find segregation, like go to New York. That's our greatest example of it.
Right.
So my question is, do you think this desire to not want to be ashamed of, say, the history of white folk in America is a big reason why?
Yeah, I think that, because here, I think it's a great question, a very provocative one, because I've always vacillated between these two sort of, they're not polar opposites, but they're slightly differing opinions, right? The one is the opinion that says, that white folks just really don't know how the system operates, and I believe that's true for a lot of white people, particularly younger people who just haven't been exposed. But the other part of me says, actually, I think folks sort of do know. Like, I sort of think folks do know, particularly if they're old enough. If they're over 55, 50, 45, they're my age, you sort of got to know something went down in this country, and you sort of know the contours of what it was, even if you don't know the specifics. And I think there's a real desire not to feel shame and guilt, which is a normal human thing. I mean, it's a normal human instinct not to feel shame. And I don't want us to feel shame either, right? I mean, I make fun of whiteness, but I'm not making fun of white people I'm making fun of are rich folks. And I don't really care if they feel shame, guilt, or anything else. They can feel whatever they want. I hope that they feel is coming. That's what I hope they feel. But for working class white people, I'm not trying to instill any guilt in them at all. I'm saying y'all got played. We all got played. It's time for us to stand up and join in solidarity and get free from this thing, because these folks are trying to punk us and treat us as idiots. And that's what they've been doing for 400 years. And it's time we get clear on it. And I think a lot of white folks don't want to admit to being punked, though, which I also get, right? Because if I just, it's hard. I mean, this is a very difficult sell, because what I'm basically asking people to do is to admit you got tricked and you got fooled and you got bamboozled, to quote Malcolm. And, and it wasn't just black folks that happened to. White folks got tricked and played as well. And I know there's a real reason for us not to want to admit that. But we got to admit it, and then we got to turn our anger and our focus on the people who did that. It's the fool me once, shame on me, fool me for 400 years, shame the hell on you. And then we're coming, expect us. And so I think that we're going to have to work through that, and we want to be compassionate. I do want us to be compassionate to white folks. I also want us to make white folks take some agency over this thing. And it's got to be both. If we're going to have restorative justice requires accountability and it requires acknowledgement of the injury. So we have to be willing to do that. And we have to be, and the way we can deal with shame, it's very simple. The way we deal with shame is to learn that there's this alternative tradition. And white people haven't learned this alternative tradition. The reason we're so ashamed of our history and the stuff that we sort of know happened, and then if we fill in the blanks, then we really know it happened. The reason we allow ourselves to, and are even capable of feeling shame about that or guilt, is because we don't know there's an alternative tradition of white resistance and allyship. How many of us learned anything about that? That wasn't in AP history either, see? Because what they did in history was they told us about the powerful white people in history, right? So it was founding fathers, most of whom were clearly not allies, right? A few were sort of better than others, but generally speaking, these were not anti-racist fighters, right? Military heroes, again, not really allies, and industrialist millionaires and multimillionaires, again, not generally allies. So if that's the white people that you learn about, and then we throw in some black folks eventually and some brown folks eventually, and we sort of give this smattering of Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks and Cesar Chavez, unless you're in Texas where they took him out, right? So they could add, Rush Limbaugh or whatever the hell they added. And seriously, they were taking out Cesar Chavez and the farm workers so they could put in Phyllis Schlafly, who led the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment, and take out Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice as well. So we threw in some people of color, but we didn't talk about white anti-racist. I mean, if I ask people, even history majors, to name 5 anti-racist white allies in history, they usually can't do it. They might name William Lloyd Garrison. They might have learned about him and his relationship with Frederick Douglass and others in the abolitionist movement. They might mention John Brown, who launched the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 and was killed for it. They might mention Goodman and Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who were killed by the Klan in '64, Klan also policemen. They might mention Viola Liuzzo, who was shot on the way back from the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. They might mention James Reeb, though probably not. There are a handful of people, but notice they're all martyrs except for Garrison, right? So it's really hard to inspire people, isn't it, when you do the work and then somebody kills you for it? Like, if you're trying to inspire white allyship with that narrative, good luck. You're going to get a lot of really whacked out people that are like, I don't care, kill me. Okay, I don't need you on my team. That's like, don't come if you want to be a martyr. That's not helpful. But the reality is there are thousands of white folks who did the work and weren't martyred for it. Some of them in the movement still doing the work today, and they're in their 70s and 80s. We didn't learn about them. And I think if we did, I think maybe that's the other missing piece of our history, right? Yeah, we got to learn more about people of color's contributions for sure. We definitely have to know more about people of color's leadership in this struggle. But we also need white folks to research and to learn in school the history of white solidarity, because if I'm going down a road and there's 2 paths, but this one is covered up with weeds and branches and leaves and trash, and I can't even see there's a road there, and nobody points it out to me, and there's no sign, what are the odds I'm going to take that path? No, I'm just going to take the path that is the path of collaboration and silence. But if you show me that there's a different road, see, I don't have to feel guilty anymore. I don't have to feel shame. Yeah, I feel shitty about the things that have happened, particularly if I have family that have been involved in it. But, here's this other tradition. I've got people in my family that owned other human beings, and I've also got abolitionists in the family. So, and I'm not responsible for either one. I can't take credit for the abolitionists, and I can't feel shame for the slave owners, but I can sure as hell decide that I'm going to be more like one than I'm going to be like the other. See, I can take one as a role model, and I can make damn sure that the other one isn't. And I can feel real pride in the ability to say, I've got this tradition, and we all have got, just about every white family's got somebody that said no. Almost everybody's got somebody that was like, this is just bullshit. Even if they weren't activists, we got somebody that knows it was wrong and is wrong. And to me, if we can connect to that, then we can move through the shame and move through the guilt and move to something different. Other questions? I'll take 2 more.
Tim, we actually are live streaming to a couple of other campuses. I'm over here. So I'm going to ask one of the questions from one of the other campuses.
Okay, great.
What is your stance on people calling you, Tim Wise, anti-white?
Well, again, as I said earlier, or sort of early on in the talk, and the person who asked it might have missed it, I guess, or maybe I just wasn't clear enough, because that certainly happens when I'm on a roll, saying things that I say. I think that, first of all, it's an interesting question, right? Because like I said, if white is a fiction, if white isn't even a real thing with a real history and a real biology, and it only has a 400-year history, this thing we call the white race, then I'm sort of like, okay, even if I was, it's not anti-white people, it's anti the concept of white. The concept of whiteness has only had one meaning. Historically, whiteness was created to subordinate anyone who could not qualify for the category. So I'm anti that. So if that makes me anti-white, let's just be specific: anti-whiteness, anti-white supremacy, and all of those things are synonym. What I am not are anti-quote-unquote white people, anti the people called white, right? And there's a big difference between that. Obviously, if I was really anti the people called white, I wouldn't be giving a speech the last half hour of which is basically how white people are harmed by white supremacy and need to get free from it. If I really didn't like white people, I'd just be like, screw it, you know? Go and take your heroin and jump off the building and drink yourself to death and blow your brains out. I mean, I would just be this unfeeling person, just didn't care about that mortality spike. I feel terrible that 500,000 white folks died. They died because of white supremacy. Whether they realize it or not, whether the society decides to think of it that way, they died because of that. So I'm anti the thing that made them do that. I'm anti the thing that made them more likely to have, I'm anti the thing that caused this increase in health care for millions of white folks is getting ready to come down the pike, right? So I'm anti-white only in the sense that we understand white and whiteness and white supremacy is synonymous and really only involved in explaining and justifying inequality. I am very pro the people called white, as well as I am pro the people called anything else. There's a huge difference between white people and whiteness, and if we don't know the difference between white people and whiteness, we're lost, and that's been our problem for over 400 years. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a statement I want to make first, and that is I saw a documentary of one of the founders of the Black Panthers, and he was being interviewed by one of the old classic newscasters. And at the end of the interview, he asked him, what would the Negro, as if this man spoke for everyone,
Right,
want to tell the white man
right.
if he had the chance? And he said something akin to, know yourself,
Right.
period, know yourself.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's what you're doing, trying to get that knowledge. And that was 40 years ago.
Right.
And it's scary that we're still having that same conversation. Well, we're only starting to have that conversation.
Right.
My question to you is, what role do you think, Christianity has played in this? And are you ever asked by religious communities to come and speak?
I'll take the second part of it first because it's quicker and easier. Yes, I do get asked to speak in front of faith communities, in front of churches, synagogues, mosques, ecumenical conferences and things of that nature where a lot of people are involved who are people of faith. I'm not saying it happens a lot or all the time, but it certainly happens a few times a year at least. I will do that and very much enjoy doing that because I think that religion, and particularly white Western Christianity, is very heavily implicated in white supremacy. And I think until the church really owns that and acknowledges their role in that, it's going to be very, very hard for us to move forward because the church has such influence on the country. And let me just give you an example of this. If you really trace back, put it in the current context of this election. So one of the groups that Donald Trump absolutely has a complete lock on are white evangelical Christians, even though Donald Trump has not likely set foot in a church for any other reason than to be seen since he was quite a young man and believes that, 2 Corinthians is called 2 Corinthians. I'm a Jew and I know better than that. Like, the hell, right? And this is a guy, they ask him his favorite Bible verse. He can't even come up. He doesn't even, there's nothing. He's got, it's nothing. I mean, nothing. I haven't read the Bible in 20 years, but I still got some. Like, come on, but he doesn't have any. And so, but evangelical white Christians don't care. Now, you might think, well, why? And plus, this is a dude that brags about sexually assaulting women, does all kinds of crude stuff, right? encourages violence at his rally, says, beat them up, take them out of here, I'll pay your defense fund. This is all not really Christian behavior, and yet white evangelicals are overlooking all of it. So it can't be about family values. This dude has got some jacked family values. It can't be about sex and licentious sexual behavior, because that defines him and always has, right? So what is it? So why? Well, if you really know the history of the white evangelical right, you know that it wasn't about that. It wasn't about school prayer. It wasn't even principally about abortion. You know what it's about? It's about segregation. Jerry Falwell got his start on the radio in Virginia railing against integration. Jesse Helms in North Carolina got his start on the radio railing against the civil rights movement. These folks were about stopping integration and stopping the government under the Reagan administration from penalizing segregated Christian academies like Bob Jones University and others. And when the government said, we're going to take away your tax exemption if you violate these civil rights laws, they got all up in arms. So these white evangelicals were so desirous of defending white supremacy that's what this movement is. Now, that's how implicated it is in the modern era, but it's implicated, always has been. Christianity positioned itself in the white Western world as the counterposition to a much darker faith coming out of the so-called Middle East, the darker faith of Islam, positioned itself as this light of the world. Constantine said that under this sign I shall conquer. He didn't say, meaning the cross, he didn't say under this sign I will unite all mankind in the brotherhood of humanity. He said under this sign I will conquer. And that became the European calling card for Christianity. And when you then create iconography that is central to your church, that represents God as white, represents Jesus as white, a first century, I beg to remind you, Palestinian Jew, right, who is not likely to have looked remotely like he looks in any stained glass or in Warner Salmon's 1940 portrait, Head of Christ, which is the most reproduced 50 million reproductions since the 1940s of this picture. You know that Jesus, it's the profile shot, with the angular nose and the long flowing golden brown blonde locks and the blue eyes and the, pasty white skin. Right? This is nonsense, I mean, it's not what any first century Palestinian Jew would have looked like. It's certainly not what the few biblical descriptions of Jesus say Jesus would have looked like. There are no real clear descriptions. The ones that do exist are in Revelation. I know that Revelation is mostly a metaphorical book. It's not necessarily all, it's meant to be very symbolic. But still, when you say you had, feet the color of burnt brass and skin the color of jasper stones and hair like wool, you've sort of told me that picture you're praying to every Sunday and the one on the Christmas cards, that ain't the guy, right? But if you reproduce that image over and over and over again, and white folks see it, and black folks see it, and their black folks don't like you messing with that white Jesus either. You could try to come into a black church and say, "Now hold on a minute, who's that guy?" And they're like, "Don't mess with that. Don't mess with Jesus." Well, now I won't, but that's not Jesus, right? Yeah, I don't know who that guy is. That is not Jesus. That is the Jesus Christ superstar version of Jesus, right? That's Mel Gibson's version of Jesus. That can't be Jesus. But that iconography maintains white supremacy, and so I think the church has to own that. The church has to own its complicity in enslavement. And boy, you talk about a lack of historical memory. So I'm Jewish. My wife is Southern Baptist. So yeah, that's a whole nother issue for another day. She was raised Southern Baptist. She's Episcopalian now. Like most Episcopalians, they were something else first. But she was raised Southern Baptist and did not know until we started dating. I don't think we were married yet. Didn't know that the Southern Baptist, she didn't know the history of her own church. That Southern Baptist and Southern Methodist, the reason there were Southern Baptist, they didn't used to always have Southern Baptist and then just Baptist. They didn't have just Southern Methodist and then Methodist. That was because the Southern folks in that tradition wanted to break away so they could continue to maintain slaves. It was a white supremacist move. And she didn't know that because they didn't talk about that. Now, some churches, have tried to move toward some method of honesty and truth-telling, but not nearly enough. And so I think that Christianity has to have that conversation. I think all faith traditions have to have that conversation and talk about our role in maintaining systems of inequality. As a Jew, I think that Jewish folks have got to own the fact that we have been allowed to become white in this country, and oftentimes that gets in the way of real solidarity with people of color. I think we got to own that piece, right? Because, not to say that there isn't a lot of hostility still aimed at Jewish people. I know particularly in this election, there's been a lot of that on social media and stuff among some of the alt-right, white nationalist supporters of Donald Trump. But the reality is, for white folks in America, And I say this as a white kid Jewish kid who grew up in Nashville. For Jewish folks in America who grew up in a place like that, right? Who grew up in Nashville, where every four-way intersection there are three churches, and the fourth one is a Walgreens, and you only have a couple of temples in town. I certainly know what it is to feel marginalized, but I have to say at the same time, I was able to matriculate into whiteness, as Jewish folks have generally been able to do. And when you're able to matriculate into whiteness, there's that constant push and pull between what is my ethnic solidarity or national solidarity versus what is my larger solidarity. So I think Christians have to have that conversation, Jews have to have that conversation. I think everybody has to. I think, just so it's not just about faith, people of faith, because sometimes it seems like we can just say people of faith have. I also want to say that people in the humanistic tradition, so-called, who are maybe really more enamored of science, and I'm certainly a person who believes in science, and I'm actually, I was raised Jewish. I'm largely agnostic, just because I'm okay with uncertainty, and I'm all right with that. I don't have to know everything. I'm good with not knowing everything. But I think that people who trust science are no different than people who trust faith in one regard, and that is they both have a role to play in fighting racism, because science has been used to justify oppression just as much as God has been. And maybe not historically, because the scientific method is quite a bit more recent in that regard than various faith traditions. But look, science was used, right, in the last 100 years in particular, to justify sterilization of certain people on the basis of race, economics, so-called lack of intelligence, right? Tens of thousands of black and brown folks, 70,000 black and indigenous women were sterilized between 1900 and 1971, often without their consent. You had several thousand white women that were sterilized by the state, and it was done in the name of science. You had some of the finest scientists in America ensconced in our finest institutions, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, et cetera, that were involved in the eugenics movement, and that's the movement from which Hitler took all of his cues. The idea that Hitler came up with that stuff and that Germany invented population control, no, that was something we were doing when Hitler was a baby. Hitler was born in 1889. We were doing that stuff by the early 1900s in this country in our finest institutions. So science has played a role and been misused. Faith has played a role and been misused. It's not that either of those are inherently evil or culpable for the problem, but both science and faith can be horribly misused and twisted for people who have pernicious motivations, and that's what we've seen. And I want all of those traditions to come to the table and own their piece of it. And if they all come to the table and own their piece of it, then I think we might be able to get somewhere. Right? Thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate it.
One more time, a big hand for Mr. Tim Wise, please. And just a reminder, he will be in the Wignall with his books. There's a reception after, and please remember to turn in your surveys. And thank you for coming.